Hello, everyone. This is Reverend Squatch, and according to my wife, I am the world's strongest and nerdiest preacher. What do you think? Let's get into the video. Now, in this installment of this five-part series, this is installment 2, we're going to talk about Gamera, the guardian of the universe, and what would happen if he was added in to this world. Now, we've already added in Skull Island and said what we think would happen. Let's put Gamera in. First off, he's in the Pacific Ocean just like Skull Island is. So, what part of the Pacific? Well, near Japan, south of Japan. There are remnants of an ancient city, an ancient underwater city. These were some of the first Atlanteans that came to be. And they were doing work in genetics. And, they created Gauss and Godzilla, not Godzilla, I apologize, Gauss and Gamera. Well, Gauss destroyed their civilization. Thankfully, the other Atlanteans, some of them survived and gave birth to who we know today as the Atlanteans within Marvel, Namor and his Atlanteans. But Gauss has been sleeping. And over time, the same thing happens that happened in the Gamera movies. Gauss is awakened. But it's not as big of a deal this time. You see, Japan has its own superheroes, and the Avengers exist. The Silver Samurai is definitely somebody that could give a Gauss a run for their money. His sword can cut through anything. Basically, the only thing it can't cut through are metals like adamantium. That's it. So, we go against Gauss, and Gamera may not even need to wake up. But let's say he does need to wake up. It basically ends the same as it did in the Gamera movies. He beats Gauss. And, maybe some superheroes attack him, but I don't really think that's going to happen. I do think, like in a lot of Marvel, they figure out, hey, this thing isn't evil, it's just trying to help. And Gamera just goes back to sleep until he's needed again. Now, this may get the attention of Atlantis and the Atlanteans, and if it does, they will go to the city, the ancient city, and start to rebuild around Gamera, because this is where Gamera's kind of hidey hole is, the ancient, subterranean thing they kept him in. Well, the Atlanteans restore the city completely. And they might start actually working into genetics again if they can get that information. I think they are intelligent enough to do that. I think it does work. And I think they start small because they've seen what happens. I think all they really do is maybe test some gene splicing and maybe create some new mounts or maybe some new companion animals. Something like that. No, nothing big. But this does actually change the world a little bit. This does affect the world. It brings up another oceanic city outside of the Atlantic Ocean this time, a Pacific version of Atlantis. They keep the name as Mu, MU, and a thriving metropolis forms. Maybe after about 10 or 20 years, bring it up to current day probably, instead of like the 90s when Gamera happened. So bring it up to 2020. That's where we'll cut off. And you've got maybe 5 million Atlanteans in the new Atlantis, many scientists and many warriors to defend them. And Gamera's just there happily sleeping unless he's needed. You don't have a huge change. It does give a slight change in the power dynamic, but typically Namor has been more about just keeping his people safe than overthrowing the surface world. Typically. So I don't think this really changes that. I think Namor is just like, oh, let's just keep our people safe and coexist with the surface world. Maybe he even shares this information with Reed Richards. I think Reed would be very interested in what these ancients knew. And that's about all the changes that happen here. If somebody tried to control Gamera or something like that, I believe his genetic programming is strong enough and advanced enough that he couldn't be controlled by anybody less than an Omega level telepath. It would take the likes of Xavier or Jean Grey, maybe Emma Frost, to actually control Gamera. Somebody at that level, like the top of their game. And even then, they're not going to have absolute control. What are your thoughts on this? Give me some feedback. Let me know. God bless, and I love you all.